Hey there, visual economic community. If there has been one phrase that could define the phenomenon of globalization that we have experienced over recent decades, it is undoubtedly made in China. But if you are loyal followers of visual economic, you already know that there are more and more doubts that this will continue to be the case. The trade war with the US, the takeover of Hong Kong, the increasingly authoritarian and ideological drift of Xi Jinping, the possible conflict over Taiwan. You know how it goes. There are plenty of reasons to wonder what is going to happen with all this globalization from now on. However, as we've already explained on other occasions, even if China begins to decline as the world's factory, other countries such as Singapore, Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, or even Mexico could gradually replace it. Some in the most advanced industries and others in the most rudimentary ones. But today we're going to talk about one of the countries that could benefit the most in this matter. Which country are we talking about? Well, Vietnam, no less.
Vietnam at the top of the list of winners in the China-US trade war.
That's right, in this video we will tell you what Vietnam has been doing to get richer and take the lead. We will analyze whether or not it can absorb all that juicy investment that is being cut off from the Asian giant. And above all, we will try to answer the following question. Will Vietnam be a kind of new China in miniature? Today, we will answer all these questions, but before, did you know that your personal information is being sold on the internet without your consent? This practice is becoming more widespread, and the number of records exposed online is on the rise. According to the 2022 Annual Data Breach Report by the Identity Theft Resource Center, the number of victims has gone up nearly 41.5% from 2021. It's important to be concerned about this issue, as scammers can use the consumer data they obtain to steal money or impersonate others. However, there's no need to panic just yet. You have the right to protect your privacy by asking data brokers to remove the information they have on you. The challenge is that this process could take years to complete manually. But don't worry, there is a solution. Our sponsor, Incogni, can help you solve this problem in just 3 simple steps. Create an account and tell Incogni whose personal data they'll be removing. Grant Incogni the right to work for you. They'll contact the data brokers and request the deletion of your personal data. Sit back and relax, Incogni will handle any objections and keep you updated on their progress every step of the way. And the best part, the first 100 people to use the code ECONOMICEN at the link below will receive a 60% discount on Incogni, so don't miss your chance to protect your privacy. To answer whether or not Vietnam will be able to surf the new wave of globalization that seems to be coming, we first need to understand where it is coming from and where it is going. At first glance, Vietnam's recent history is very, very similar to that of China. Yes, that's correct. Both countries have historically been communist regimes. Both have been closed to international trade from head to toe, and above all, both have been very, very poor. But do you know the most curious thing of all? Both China and Vietnam took exactly the same path out of poverty. When their communist dictators died, Mao Zedong in the case of China and Lee Duan in the case of Vietnam, the two countries undertook a series of reforms aimed at privatizing part of the economy and opening the country to foreign investment. Thus, in 1986, began a movement that would change the history of Vietnam forever, the Doi Moi. The Doi Moi, or simply the Renovation, were a series of measures aimed at moving from a communist and completely state-run economy to a self-styled socialist market economy. The first measures began by abolishing collective farms, giving way to small plots of land that each family farmed autonomously. In addition, these peasant families were allowed to sell their products and price controls were lifted. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond that, Vietnam abolished the licensing system that forced anyone who wanted to start a business to ask permission from the politician in charge. Basically, freedom of entrepreneurship was given. In addition, a large part of the government-controlled economy was liberalized to allow the private sector to operate in sectors in which it had previously been prohibited from doing so. The result of these measures was instantly noticeable. Since Doi Moi began, Vietnam has grown by more than 360%, with an annual growth rate of around 7%, a much higher rate than most of the surrounding countries. After this, industry began to take off and leave behind the unproductive agricultural sector. And this was very important, because out of the 7 points of average annual growth, the mere fact of taking people out of the countryside and putting them to work in factories accounts for 5 points. No kidding. In any case, perhaps the most important thing about Doi Moi was that, apart from the Industrial Revolution it brought to the country, this plan also served to expand trade agreements with the rest of the world and further swell the economy with foreign trade and foreign investment. To give you an idea, in 1985, exports accounted for approximately 5% of GDP. Well, in 2010, this figure reached 90%. Along the same lines, foreign investment as a percentage of GDP even surpassed that of China itself. This was something that was also achieved thanks to the special economic zones, small regions of the country with lower taxes, fewer regulations, and in general, an environment designed to favor the entry of foreign capital and the export of domestic products to other countries. Come on, it's a very attractive mix for foreign companies. Although, yes, okay, I know what you're thinking. Let's see. How much of that investment is nothing more than sweatshops where kids are sewing balls or t-shirts? Is that really a model of progress? Well, pay attention because it's not that simple. The textile sector represents less than 10% of all foreign investment in Vietnam. In fact, the country's main exports are not cheap t-shirts, but electronics and chemicals, more or less simple, but by no means negligible. So in light of all this data, Vietnam seems fully prepared to receive tons and tons of investment. It has shown that it can grow and that it is no longer just a land of farmers. Its exports are diversified and focus on products that, while maybe not of the highest quality, are not the worst. However, as the saying goes, all that glitters is not gold, and things are never that simple. And to all these data, we must add one more factor. You see, Vietnam is still a tremendously poor country, much poorer than China. We're talking about a country with a standard of living equivalent to that of India or Mexico 50 years ago. It is true that its recent growth has been spectacular, but there are two reasons why it is still such a poor country. On the one hand, Vietnam was starting from the bottom. In 1986, it was half as rich as China, and it is still half as rich today. But on the other hand, Vietnam started its reforms 10 years later than the Asian giant. And in that sense, Vietnam's problem is that, although it has grown at a good pace, it has not had that much time. So now the real question is this relevant for speculating whether Vietnam will be the new China? Yes, it is very relevant. Foreign investors are not only looking for places with low wages and low taxes, they are also looking for countries with a strong domestic market. A market that not only serves them to manufacture their products and send them abroad, but also to sell in their own country or to find quality suppliers. And naturally, in a country with such a miserable economy as Vietnam, this is much more difficult, which, by the way, explains why so many companies remain in China despite all the problems that have arisen lately. And by the way, remember we told you that much of Vietnam's growth has come from moving people from the countryside to the factories? Well, that's a move that can no longer be repeated. Once you've already moved a worker out of the fields, you can't simply move them back. In fact, the rate of movement from the field to the factories has been more than 30% lower in the last decade than it was during the previous decade. So the questions we can ask ourselves are, what can Vietnam do to keep growing, keep modernizing, and keep attracting more and more investment? Is this apparent slowdown in economic activity a natural occurrence, or are the Vietnamese not doing as well as they seem to be? Well, let's take a look.
The law of minimum effort?
Let's be clear, Vietnam's growth has been spectacular, almost an economic miracle. Nevertheless, there is a large academic consensus here. If Vietnam had not made some big mistakes, its growth would have been even greater. Much, much, much higher. But of all these problems, 3 stand out as having hindered, and above all, continue to hinder the growth of this country in the future. If I ask you what advantages China had when it started to attract foreign investment after its reforms, many will cite its huge size, low wages, or low taxes. And all that is true, but it also had an advantage that is not often talked about. For such a poor country, China had a reasonably well-educated population. The fact is that without a good number of engineers, physicists, chemists, and other professionals, it is very difficult to operate a factory, let alone innovate or improve productivity. So the question is, how is Vietnam doing in that regard? Well, apparently very well. Their human capital index is the highest in the region, higher than that of China itself, but let's not go too fast. If Vietnam scores so well in this type of index, it is because its population is very young, healthy, and has received a good secondary education. But that's as far as it goes. Take a look at this chart. As you can see, the number of university students in Vietnam is very low, far below similar countries in terms of income, such as Indonesia or the Philippines. So yes, everyone has received a decent education, but almost no one has gone a step further. They haven't been to college. That's not all though. If we look at the percentage of people who have received what is usually called technical education and training, which is comparable to what would be a middle or high school degree, Vietnam is the worst scoring country in the entire region. The country's educational reforms have worked very well, but if Vietnam wants to move up the development ladder, it will have to start better training the workers who bring the most value to an economy. But the truth is that, compared to the rest of the problems, this one seems almost trivial. In Vietnam, 98% of the population has access to electricity. This is an achievement that has been made possible thanks to major government investment in infrastructure, such as the electricity transmission network. Even so, outages are far more frequent than they should be, and the grid could barely support a few more gigawatts, which wouldn't be a huge problem if Vietnam wasn't looking to attract highly power-intensive companies, but it's just the opposite. On top of that, it turns out that Vietnam's roads are a mess, many of them virtually impossible to drive on, and the country has no river navigation or railroad system to compensate for the terrible state of its national road network. And in the case of drinking water, it is a very similar story. Vietnam has very serious problems in maintaining the quality of its water, even in some of its exclusive economic zones. Crazy. The question is, why does it have so many infrastructure problems? Well, the main reason is not due to a lack of investment, but to maintenance. In the last 20 years, the government has spent money like crazy to build all kinds of infrastructure, but they have forgotten that that alone is not enough. And if the facilities are not maintained, then you have basically thrown all that money away. To give you an idea, only 10% of infrastructure spending goes to maintenance, while the OECD average is 30%, and neighboring countries such as Indonesia reach 40%. Yet there is one more factor that makes the final results much worse: the tremendous corruption and the tremendous bureaucracy. To give you an idea, out of every 100 dongs, the Vietnamese currency, that the government spends on the maintenance of the irrigation system, 70 go to administrative costs, which is often a euphemism for the pockets of a politician or a high official. What's more, since the government subsidizes the use of this infrastructure so much, for example with water or energy prices that barely cover 60% of the costs, the use of this infrastructure skyrockets, causing increased wear and tear of the infrastructure. It's a real mess. But even so, visual economic viewers, don't think that this is the biggest problem in Vietnam. Pay close attention. I want you to take a close look at this chart. As you can see, over the years, the weight of the public sector in Vietnamese industry has plummeted from 55% in the early Doi Moi years to less than 15% today. However, this has been largely due to increased foreign investment, rather than the growth of a strong private sector within its borders. Although it may not seem like it, this is a deliberate choice. The government does not want a new local business elite to emerge that could compete with it, as in a way is happening in China or with companies like Alibaba or Tencent. The fact is that SOEs remain a fundamental part of the Vietnamese economy. They basically have a monopoly over key sectors such as finance or infrastructure. And unlike in other countries such as China or Eastern Europe, in the transition to a market economy, Vietnam did not carry out major privatizations, but chose to give more autonomy to state-owned enterprises and merge those that were failing with others that were healthy. And so, although the number of SOEs has plummeted from 12,000 before Doi Moi to just over 3,000 today, their weight in GDP has barely fallen from 37% in 1990 to 36% in 2010. And yes, I know what you're thinking, but are SOEs in Vietnam really that bad? After all, the Chinese state still has a very significant say in these types of enterprises, and they don't seem to be completely dysfunctional. Well, the truth is that no, they are not bad. They are terrible. According to a study that analysed how entry into the World Trade Organization affected both private and state-owned companies, the latter were 3 times less likely to close if they were in a bad financial situation. What's more, while private companies improved their productivity tremendously, no change was found in state-owned companies, and despite this, their income continued as before. Of course, many Vietnamese entrepreneurs complain that the playing field is not level. State-owned companies have much more preference when it comes to receiving loans from banks banks, which are also mostly government owned, and they also receive other benefits such as free land concessions or preferential access to government contracts. But let's be more concrete. Let's try to see how big the difference is between private and state-owned productivity. One way to look at this is to ask how much money a company needs to invest to get one more dollar. The lower this number, the more efficient the company is. This is known as the capital efficiency ratio. Well, for Vietnamese private companies, this ratio is 0.47, while for state-owned companies, it is 1.62. And keep in mind, we are talking about state-owned companies in the same sector, and under the same conditions, there is no smoke and mirrors here. This means that to achieve the same results, the state-owned sector must invest more than 3 times the same amount of money. Outrageous. The conclusion is that several economists point out that if Vietnam had a public sector more similar to that of neighboring countries, between just the years 2008 and 2012, its growth would have been 40% higher. Yes, that is correct, 40%. So in short, if Vietnam wants to continue growing at a good pace and become the new China, it will no longer be able to use the tricks of the past. It is going to have to solve its problems with higher education, infrastructure, and above all, the competitiveness of its public sector. Be that as it may, and at this point, it is now your turn. Do you think Vietnam will be able to take full advantage of the flight of Chinese companies as is currently happening? Will we see a new economic boom? Or will it remain stuck in the famous middle income trap? What other measures do you think it could take to improve its competitiveness? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visual Economic, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it. I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.